Okay, so welcome everyone to our ERWC webinar. I am Kia Ross, the program analyst for the Center for the Advancement of Reading and Writing, CARW. And I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, Helping Students Become Climate Stewards. This webinar outlines the critical role storytelling plays in climate stewardship. In this webinar, Xochitl Bentley offers entry points for developing environmental literacy by addressing underlying mindsets and interrogating narrative framing in the information landscape. Environmental problem solving depends on civic action that offers counterstories to our current unsustainable trajectory. And just a few announcements before we jump into the webinar. Our 2025-2026 upcoming webinar series. So we have on March 19th, Quintos and Community Writing, the stories of culturally sustaining writing instruction, presented by Dr. Monica Baldonado Ruiz. April 16th, Collaborative Conversations and LPAC Engagement, presented by Dr. Christine Snyder. May 21st, 2026, Implementing Universal Design for Learning Strategies in ERWC Modules, presented by Dr. Jenny Crisco. And so you can find these upcoming webinars on our ERWC website under upcoming events. You can also find on our website upcoming ERWC Introductory 3.0 high school and middle school workshops. And so if you'd like to have access to our curriculum, we encourage you to get certified by attending one of our workshops. And we're happy to announce that we will be at CATE 2026, March 5th through 7th at the Hilton LAX here in Los Angeles. Our um, join our ERWC team there. We will have an ERWC booth. Our presenters include some of our very own ERWC steering committee members, um, committee faculty, and our very own CARW co-director, ERWC program director, Dr. Cindy Peck. We will be hosting a reception March 7th from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. And our 2026 ERWC Literacy Conference is June 29th, 2026 at the Hyatt Regency San Francisco Airport. Registration is now open. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Ontario Garcia, which we're super happy to have. If you have a moment, go on over and stop by on our website and register for our conference. And if you're interested in presenting at our conference, our call for presenters with a deadline of March 27th, you can also get more information on this on our website. And follow us on any of one of our social media handles. I'll be sure to drop all of these links into the chat so that you all have access to them. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Xochitl Bentley. Xochitl has been a secondary ELA educator for 13 years in the greater Los Angeles area. She is a co-director of the CSUN Writing Project and a curriculum developer for the expository reading and writing curriculum. She is a certified California naturalist, a certified California environmental educator, and a member of the Climate Re- Reality Leadership Corps. Xochitl, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kia. And I am sharing. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us on a Thursday. Thursday is the day of the week I'm usually bone tired, so big hat tip to you for joining us on this day of the week. And part of the origin story of my interest in this topic is a student I had several years ago who was very disgruntled with our school's approach to environmental topics in the classroom. And she told me, uh, you know, teachers here share a lot of sad poems about environmental destruction, and we feel very sad and guilty and negative, and then that's it. That's like the end of the discussion. And I'm waiting for the part two. I want to hear about the tools you're going to teach me so I can problem solve. And so I'm always grateful to that student for her candor and her frustration because I think it's true. We all know too well in our school sites the curricular constraints and the time constraints and the initiative fatigue. But we know that that part two is often missing. And so I think about her and kind of that implied call to action where we need that part two when we talk about climate stewardship. So I would say the main claim is that storytelling is a chief survival skill. And the reason I think it's so important that we foster our students as able, adept, enthusiastic storytellers is that it's the only way we learn how to offer counter stories to those stories that don't really serve us in our sustainable existence. And so throughout the presentation, I'll talk about how we're pushing back against narratives that don't really serve us. But I also think this is a really empowering claim that all of us can engage in storytelling. All of us can manipulate narrative in ways to serve that purpose of that specific call to action we want to use to sway and persuade. And I'd like to think that what we're doing when we focusing on climate stewardship is helping students engage in these acts of rehearsal that lead to acts of advocacy in real world contexts. And so I know, like many educators, I spend a lot of time thinking, like, what can I do to sort of break down that classroom wall and help students see the connections between what we're doing and how meaningful and impactful it can be beyond these walls. And so I think that with the emphasis on storytelling, we're teaching them that it's not just about learning facts about climate change, it's learning about the storytelling tools that can help us advocate for ourselves to protect our own lives and our livable future. And I just love this image from MIT, thinking about at what scale you want to try to implement a solution. I think it's also really instructive if we think about stories' potential multiplying effect. So we might foster a storyteller in our own classroom, and based on who they reach with their new audiences, the multiplying effect continues. And I think that's really, really powerful that endlessly storytelling has this infinite impact that we can't always discern but happens. And I just want to present this one quote from this slim book that I just find so helpful and I return to again and again when I think about the power of narrative. And it's from Randy Olson's Houston, We Have a Narrative. And he's addressing this question of why present facts through a story. And he says, telling a simple story can be frustrating, but it may be the single most important challenge for all scientists. The tendency of scientists to present endless piles of facts, unable to find the singular narrative onto which everyone can focus, has become a reason many science stories, including that of global warming, fail to resonate with the public. And when I share this quotation with my students, they say, that really resonates. Retweet that because they'll do a lot of research and learn tons and heaps about an environmental problem. And when they go to present to their classmates, they're like, there's so many bored faces right now. And the accretion of facts isn't the way to grab the audience and hook them and maintain their attention. It's how you can figure out a way to embed those facts in a narrative that you relay in a compelling manner. And so, a simple strategy that Randy Nelson shares in that book that I just adore is the and, but, therefore storytelling method. And so, in my class, we use this for postcard campaigns. We might know that there's a bill under scrutiny in the House of Reps. We might realize that in the upcoming legislative session, this is something that is going to be debated that our representatives really need to know that we care about this. And so this narrative structure is very recognizable. It has three parts. It's the and, but, and therefore. So the and of a story represents the situation, what's happening. The but is the complication, the problem, the conflict. And the therefore is the resolution. What are we going to do? How do we wrap this up? How do we solve it? And if you teach your students at any level these three parts, you have a structure that's digestible, that's memorable, that you can use in almost any context. So, for example, for this one bill that students and I looked at, gosh, I think in 2017, was about the much needed funding for urban forest canopy, that many densely populated urban areas do not have enough trees, enough tree canopy, and as a result, these places suffer a high incidence of what we call urban heat islands. It's extremely hot because they're in places where there's a lot of asphalt, a lot of concrete, and that heat is just getting sucked and trapped. So the first part of this story says, surrounded by the natural beauty of Mulholland Park, I wondered how more students could stand where I'm standing and have access to a much needed source of peace and quietude. Without protected tree canopy, many LA communities will suffer increased incidence of respiratory diseases as well as from nature deficit disorder. Urban heat island and drought conditions will make more severe, even deadly. Contact your representative to urge support for Assembly Bill 1530. We need urban forestry funding for a resilient, more sustainable future. And again, I just want to emphasize this three-part structure. I've used it with fourth graders, I've used it with seventh graders, I've used it with young kiddos in high school, and my seniors about to graduate. It gives them a really tidy narrative structure for offering a call to action that allows them to practice storytelling with concision. As you know, sometimes often we give a lot of time to narrative writing with elaboration as the goal. But concision is different, and it's really important if you want to maintain the audience's attention. And so, what I'm going to do in this presentation is share with you 6 storytelling stances that I find to be really important entry points for talking about climate stewardship in a sustained way. And I know that many of you know the challenges that I experienced at school sites. I feel that what I do with environmental topics often feels tacked on. It feels like a one-off with an Earth Day festival. Sometimes I feel like my colleagues don't have buy-in because they're so busy with their content focus. So I think these storytelling stances are really effective in keeping in mind what I can do to create climate curriculum that's organized, purposeful, and meaningful, and offers counter stories to narratives that just don't serve us. So, the first storytelling stance is storytelling for systemic responsiveness. So, many people plan having in mind what they learned in hindsight, but it's rare that we consciously practice the skill of foresight, that we try to anticipate problems that might arise. And so this storytelling stance helps us think with our students about what does it mean to be proactive in anticipation of possible emergencies? It's not just reacting after the fact, oh no, emergency disaster zone. There's the zone is flooded with misinformation. I'm not even sure what the facts are. It's before things get out of hand, what systems and structures can we put in place to anticipate those really tricky, hard moments? And so an example that my students and I really focus on, especially since January 2025, is rapid wildfire spread. Not only was it very scary in LA County to anticipate that wildfire might spread quickly in the direction that you live and you work and where people you care about exist, but also, it seemed like there was a lot of misinformation. Sometimes we got emergency texts that were erroneous, and sometimes we weren't sure who to turn to for accurate, timely information. And so, part of being systemically ready and responsive is not just being reactive, but being proactive. And in order to practice emergency scenarios or anticipating emergency scenarios, we use the VUCA tool. And this tool was popularized in the mid 1980s by organization leaders that were trying to help their workers face complex problems. Like these were not simple problems. There were problems that seemed to have a lot of feedback inputs. And so this acronym VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So when we think about what's volatile, it's like those shifts and changes that create this like intense fluctuation over time. Uncertainty is thinking about the unpredictability of events, like when is this going to happen? And then complexity, thinking about how a problem it can have multiple factors feeding into it, and it's not always easy to discern the cause and effect. Like there might be multiple causes or factors creating the problem. And then lastly, ambiguity. What is ambiguous? There's a lack of clarity about why the problem is occurring, why does it exist, why is it worsening? But also there might be mixed or contradictory messages about what the problem even is. And so by presenting our students with scenarios and having them mentally work through it with the VUCA tool, it helps them talk about problem solving with more nuance. And that's a hugely important goal, not just for our literacy instruction, and it's embedded in the Common Core standards, writing and talking with nuance, but the idea that to be an adept problem solver, you have to speak in more nuanced ways about how the problem is presenting. So here's an example of using the VUCA tool with, say, water management. So what I try to do with my students so they try it for themselves is when thinking about these terms, questions you can generate to push your inquiry about the problem. So, for example, with what is volatile, I might ask, how will extreme weather events increase the risks of waterway flooding? With what is uncertain, will drought conditions in the Southwest increase resentment about exported water? And this is a huge issue. You know, a lot of our um, friends that live in states right next to the Colorado River, they do not love how much water Californians take from the Colorado River. So this is a really timely conversation topic. What is complex? How will competing claims on water resources be resolved? And this is something that came to mind during the current president's first administration when he attempted a border wall. That wall would violate certain existing water treaties where people on both sides would benefit from the flow of water. So it didn't make sense with some existing treaties. And then what is ambiguous is the way we allocate water to agriculture sustainable. And this is an opportunity to help students think about water in a more nuanced way because oftentimes we hear, oh, big ag, those farmers in Central California are taking way too much water. Well, there's a difference between a very small family farm who's just trying to survive and a mega farm backed by several corporations that are taking quite a bit. So again, even with the representation of farmers in the central area, like there needs to be more nuance in that discussion. But that's just one example of how you could use the VUCA tool, which students find really helpful. Next, storytelling about root causes. So I think the more you spend time with thinking about environmental problems, you realize that part of the issue is that, like most problems, we confuse symptoms and root causes and sometimes don't know the difference. And so I think it's important to foster this awareness of like, well, what is the symptom and what is the root cause? Because it helps our students gather data for the stories they want to talk about in a way that's specific and authentic. So for example, I remember a couple years ago, we were talking about electrification and specifically electric cars. And I could tell that a lot of students in the room did not have buy-in to the idea of an electric vehicle. And I wasn't sure why. And I realized that there was some range anxiety. Some people thought, like, well, gosh, if you charge a car, maybe you're overestimating the charge and how long you'll be able to drive. Some people thought about, like, well, maybe there's charging stations here and here, but maybe they're not equally accessible throughout LA County. But digging even deeper and getting more data just through interviews and storytelling that was very like informal, there was some anxiety about like, gosh, I have a relative that works on classic cars, and this is really important to us and our livelihood and our family. And this challenge is something that we're really passionate about. And so with hearing those stories, you could see that we were gathering different data points. There was some gathering in the form of like, well, here are graphs showing that more charging stations exist, therefore creating greater literal accessibility. But also there's this anxiety and stigma attached to EVs with a lot of people. And so I love looking at this one article by Trisha Wayne, where she makes an argument for integrating big data, so quantitative data captured at large scale, and thick data, qualitative data emerging from ethnographic research methods that uncover people's stories. And I think it's so powerful for students to think about different data points, some that come from stories, some that come in a way that seems a little bit more like hard fact finding. Because sometimes you'll see that one piece of data is not the whole story. And sometimes one piece of data has an outsized impact because it's addressing a root cause and not just skimming the superficial surface. The next storytelling stance I want to talk about is storytelling beyond either or. And so either or often presents as a logical fallacy that I think a lot of us are familiar with, which is the false dilemma. So you can either do this or do that. And it often presents as if there's only two options, one positive, one negative, and that's where the thinking stops. And I want to challenge that because this is very typical for the voter who's thinking about environmental topics. And what a voter will often hear with ad campaigns is like, well, you can protect the environment or you can grow the economy. And that framing is really superficial and tends to block deeper discussion about what is at issue with the either or framing. In their book, Both and Thinking, Wendy K. Smith and Marianne W. Lewis encourage readers to interrogate this framing. What if the problem is that we are too narrow in how we frame the problem? We see two roads and think that those are our only options, rather than diving deeper, asking why we feel forced to make that choice to begin with. And I think this is really important for our students because unfortunately, a lot of students encounter environmental topics in the classroom too early in the form of a debate. So, hey, you, here's a topic, adopt a pro or a con stance. We're going to start doing this debate tomorrow. And the problem with that is that sometimes their thinking and their research is severely undercooked if you want them to offer ideas about environmental topics that often have many different angles that you can adopt when thinking about that topic. Something that I think is an excellent mentor text for helping students think beyond either or thinking is a video mentor text. The fabulous environmental influencer and writer Isaiah Hernandez has a video series on YouTube called Teaching Climate Together. And one of my favorite episodes was called Desert Ecology with Mojave Desert Land Trust. And what's really super about this example is Isaiah's models interviewing a variety of people that work in the Mojave Desert on behalf of conservation efforts, where he's doing much more listening and learning than interjecting and trying to just share his own talking points. But he shares a lot of information about how in the Mojave Desert, there's competing environmental interests where people really think their priority is the one that should be focused on. So in the Mojave Desert, a lot of people are focused on solar panel development. But a lot of people, such as at the Mojave Desert Land Trust, really care about current ongoing conservation efforts. And so what he talks about in a part of this video is how a plan developed that was written by multiple stakeholders where solar development would happen in places that were designated as not as ecologically rich. And it's a really powerful statement about how you can still advocate for your own point of view and what you think should happen in the space, but not shortchanging one or the other and figuring out, like, well, how can we have a solution that encompasses all our goals? And I think another reason I love that text as a mentor text is it helps us think about critical features of place-based calls to action. So, a critical feature of a place-based call to action is communicating how the story of the problem tends to be framed before communicating, this is the story we are creating now. So, the example of that video, he spends a lot of time talking about when we think of deserts, we tend to think of them as barren and empty and devoid of any life. But in fact, a desert, specifically in this case, the Mojave Desert, is incredibly ecologically rich and just doesn't stand up to that stereotypical notion of a desert. The next storytelling stance is storytelling for reciprocity and kinship. And there's lots of ways I approach this in the classroom, but one way is to figure out, sorry, skipped ahead, is how to incorporate these concepts in a way that helps students understand how the first two offer a counter story to the last two. So when we talk about kinship and reciprocity, kinship is an awareness of ecological interdependence grounded in relationships of belonging. And I tell my students that this helps us get away from thinking about there's a pyramid and humans are at the apex and all the other species are down here, and it's totally a hierarchical arrangement. When we think about kinship and reciprocity, we're really thinking about species existing at different points in a related web of coexistence. And that's the goal, sustainable coexistence. And the principle of reciprocity describes a mutual exchange or dependence that benefits each and all, but also includes mutual responsibilities. So, how can we support simultaneous flourishing of species instead of just thinking about what humans want and need and how nature just exists as resources for us to consume? And these principles offer the counterstory to anthropocentric thinking, which is the belief that the human being exists at the center of the universe and an extractive practice. So, extractivism, the practice of extracting natural resources for profit. And I think it's really powerful to offer that last term because when students do kind of a self-audit of how they consume things, the things they want to buy or shop for, they realize that this desire to consume, 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 it's happening kind of unconsciously, but a lot of this urge to consume exists because we think that things need to be convenient and happen quickly, my way, right away. And we need to consciously kind of slow down and think about how we can fight the temptation to always think about what we can consume and how quickly we can do it. So, a way that I bring in those principles is layering a common reading practice. So, a very recognizable reading practice is say, mean, and matter. So, you're reading a text, watching a text, and you're thinking about what does the text say? What does the author mean? And why does this matter? But as a second layer, we ask ourselves, what are the stakes of the story? Who gets a say? And how do we repair and restore? And so that gets to questions about if there's some type of environmental problem, whose voices have a place at the table of decision making? Do we center Indigenous voices as an example, or are they left out? And in terms of how do we repair and restore, what can human beings do next that can avoid just perpetuating the same problems that got them here in the first place? And so one text I like to suggest, just because I am so enormously inspired by it, is The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And this came out a couple years ago. And she focuses on the serviceberry because as it moves through the ecosystem, it's endlessly transformed moving through the circular economy. And it's such a great example of how we can create abundance through a circular economy as opposed to just scarcity. And so something she says, which I just love, is the relationships nurtured by gift thinking diminish our sense of scarcity and want. In that climate of sufficiency, our hunger for more abates, and we take only what we need in respect for the generosity of the giver. Climate catastrophe and biodiversity loss are the consequences of unrestrained taking by humans. Might cultivation of gratitude be part of the solution? And my students really sit with this idea. It's often a very different way of thinking for them. And I want to share that a student created a beautiful zine based on the service berry, this principle of gift thinking and abundance and endlessly circulating. He talked about how the Little Free Library is a perfect example of gift thinking. And so in this beautifully illustrated zine, he, includes pictures of a little free library you see on a street corner here, you see in front of a business here, and how that happening all over the globe, and how the circulation of these books and stories just are endlessly exchanged and given, that beautifully exemplifies the type of principle she explores in her book. The next storytelling stance I want to talk about is storytelling with intergenerational awareness. And so, something I've noticed almost always with students is they frequently have heard the term sustainability, but it has rarely been defined for them. And so, we talk about the origins of the concept of sustainable development, which appears in the UN Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which was published in 1987. And in this document, sustainability is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is so beautiful because it makes us think about not only what we have inherited from our ancestors, but really what are we going to leave for our descendants? And I think it helps us tease out connotation meanings of the word inheritance. So, like, what will our descendants inherit based on what we do, civic action, civic policy with our voting? It's a different way of thinking about the inheritance we leave. And so, one way we talk about um, living and existing with intergenerational awareness is through some picture book inquiry. And We're Water Protectors is a big hit with my students. And I will say with my high school senior students, they love when we bring in picture books. It takes them back to an earlier innocent time in their life. I will say I frequently have students volunteering to read when I bring in a picture book. It's just that happy memory, I think a core memory of being on a rug in kindergarten and just being read to and delighting in a story. And this is very appealing to seniors who are very tired by 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And so this book won the Caldecott a few years ago, and it's really, really powerful. And what illustrator Michaela Go does is in her illustrations, she really honors the author Carol Lindstrom's Ojibwe culture with floral and animal motifs. And this story explores the Standing Rock Sioux tribes fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline and talking about the implications for water. And talking about water is something that has rights on its own, something that should be respected, kind of in the self-evident way. And what I do in my classroom is we take, say, a picture book and we juxtapose it with other sources because I really want to broaden this idea of what constitutes source relevance for their research. So at this time, I use this book, and then one thing I kind of mashed with it was this tweet by Secretary Deb Haaland, who was the first Indigenous cabinet secretary. And something she said is, water is a sacred resource that is essential to tribes and communities, growing crops, sustaining wildlife and the environment, empowering agricultural businesses. We can and should continue to work across the aisle to address persistent drought conditions across the West. And I think it's really powerful because you can put these sources together on what I call an idea molecule. So, in the right corner in the green, here's a quote from the picture book. We are stewards of the earth. Our spirits have not been broken. And then here's a quote from the C-SPAN transcript of her confirmation hearing as Department Secretary of the Interior. And something she emphasizes is, I know that when it comes to land development, tribal consultation is important. And then at the bottom of the molecule, students produce their own questions. So one question they produced was, do pipeline developers have a history of consulting or ignoring tribes? And the answer is yes. The American government has a huge history of ignoring existing tribal agreements. But you can see that by adding a picture book, adding a C-SPAN transcript, adding a tweet, the students are starting to notice different things as a result of bringing these different type of sources in conversation with each other. And something that they really notice is that Indigenous writers, when talking about the protests, would talk about the water protectors, but news sources that were not written by someone related to the tribes is they would talk about the water protesters. And that was really interesting to notice that the way some writers self-identified was very much, I protect water. Water is something that should exist in abundance. And that, the names we give often suggest what we value. And I think we see the principle of kinship in that self-titling. The last storytelling stance is storytelling for collective mobilization. And I think this is really important for environmentalists and climate stewards because so often we try to do things on our own or go at it alone, or our efforts happen in these little silos. And I will say this is often the deliberate result of corporate ad campaigns that want to talk about what you, the individual, have done to be responsible for, say, trash that exists. And so the recycling ad campaigns that have been so successful for the last 3 decades are really the result of, corporate sponsored ads trying to place the onus on the individual shoulders as opposed to thinking about, wait a minute, who produces all this plastic? These corporations. And so for collective mobilization, I want to emphasize this for several reasons. First, our students are enormously inspired by what our youth climate activists are already doing. And if you read the words of some of our most famous youth climate activists, like Xiuhtezcatl Martinez, Vanessa Nakate, Jamie Margolin, they talk about the way they avoid burnout as an activist is being inspired by each other, amplifying the actions that the others are taking, but also recognizing that environmental movements and actions don't exist in competition with each other, that they reinforce each other's goals, and that you really should work to be an ally and to work in cooperation with the other goals, because that's how you make a greater impact. And so I know whenever I bring in writing from a youth climate activist, I see students sitting up a little bit more seriously taking note because these are the voices that are so close to their own and age. And, they speak without jargon and their call to actions are rooted in their own lived experience. I also emphasize collective mobilization because we need to recognize that we don't have equal protection from environmental hazards. And historically, there has been a lot of toxic waste dumping in communities of color. And so this picture demonstrates a moment in the rural community of Afton in North Carolina, where the governor ordered yet another huge toxic waste dump in this rural community. And this huge protest is considered one of the sort of origin moments of the environmental justice movement, where we emphasize that we all should have equal protection from environmental hazards. And so, building on the storytelling stance of collective mobilization. Something I have my students do is engage in some community asset mapping. And this is really important because often students think of the environment is somewhere elsewhere, some like pristine stretch of wilderness where there's like no humans, not really thinking about the environment that they currently inhabit and the community they currently exist in, and how there's so much happening in our communities worthy of preservation and worthy of celebration. And so to help our students really engage in collective mobilization, we help them not only think about what's not working or broken in their community, but those assets deserve to be noticed and recognized. So I have them do some sort of version of this type of survey. And they can do it with their peers. We often do it in home interviews, which is really fun. But what is a pressing community need? What organizations, institutions, businesses, and individuals might be interested in partnering and providing support. And then thinking about the need you selected, spend some time researching relevant organizations and community groups. What organizational alliances could be built with other potential institutional allies? And I think that last question is really important because students often think, I'm going to start my own environmental nonprofit today. And I'm like, that's such a beautiful goal, but there's a lot of work already happening. Consider working in partnership with those existing organizations or building on their impact. So I think it helps them think about how joining forces can be all the more powerful. And I love seeing the responses from their surveys because they'll be like, I can't believe my best friend thinks this, or I had no idea that my dad and I were aligned philosophically. So it can be really revelatory to look at the survey results. Something I do to build on this community awareness is a personal tree rings map. And so I love trafficking and ecological metaphors in my classroom. It's my favorite thing in life. And so I say, think of a tree rings. If you look at a trunk and how each ring, these concentric circles, give you information about what the weather was like that year of that tree's life. And you see like this kind of timeline in these radiating concentric circles. I want you to create one and indicate in your tree rings map things that are important to you or suggestive of your identity and life. So one example, and gosh, I have so many examples, but this student, and I'm sorry, you can only see part of it, is this student talks about in the centric circle how much he loves playing soccer with his dad at this one park in Alhambra, and how much in the next circle he loves enjoying dinners where he can enjoy hot pot or samwoo or Korean barbecue or pho. And he realized there's this common denominator if you look at all these places in the communities he cares about, where there are places or activities where he's able to joke and laugh with the people he cares about. Like that's why he does the things he does and goes to the places he goes to, because it's about that camaraderie and that joy. And it's really fun because at first students will be looking at their tree rings map like, I don't know what to do. And then when they start kind of mapping these places and placing them in an arrangement that's personal and meaningful to them, it's amazing seeing communities come alive based on how they choose to represent these stories. And I like to really emphasize the point to students that two people writing about the same place will not write the same piece. I could write a story about the San Fernando Valley, and my husband could write a story about the San Fernando Valley, but we're going to talk about really different things because we inhabit different ways of looking at this place, and it will come across differently in our narratives. And that's a beautiful thing to talk about with your students. And so when I confer with them when they're talking about places in the community they care about, we talk about what are those place-based details that are evocative and memorable? Like, what do you really need to highlight? How do we convey lush sensory detail? And finally, what happens when we mix details rooted in first-person observation and details found in research? And that's an important question that gets back to the ABT call to action, because when you voice a call to action to an audience, you start with why I care about this or how this impacted me. Or this is personal, but I also think this could affect you. That mixing of first person and just research is really important to create compelling calls to action. And so, one thing I want to emphasize is that one of the major barriers to participating solutions is reductive narratives that don't do the topic justice. And with all our emphases on storytelling stances, is figuring out how can we tell this environmental story with more nuance? How can I tell the story of my community with more nuance? There's a richness here that often we're just scratching the surface. And the questions, and I include this on a handout that I'll push out to you. I use these questions to design my units and my lessons. So when choosing text or mentor text for environmental lesson design, I ask myself, does it challenge an anthropocentric view of the world? Does it call into question status quo practices that contribute to environmental harm? Does it shed light on what is uniquely located in a place? Does it promote system commitments on behalf of communities? Does it provide evidence that draws upon multiple data sources? Does it invite people to think and act like a future ancestor? And I'll just skim, because I know we're starting to run out of time, just skim some other entry points that have been really, really powerful and successful in my classroom. So, entry point using visual text as a hook, not a parade of statistics. So often, to hone our concern for climate change, we just drop a bunch of scary statistics on our students and they begin to shut down a little bit because it is overwhelming. And I want to suggest using visual text as the hook that maintains their attention. So there's this really incredible online gallery, but a physical gallery too at the Leopold Museum in Vienna. And 15 paintings have been tilted at the precise angle which climate change will impact the depicted landscape. So the Leopold Museum has rotated paintings of landscape and nature by the exact amount that climate change will affect the regions they depict. So I invite my students to explore this online gallery, and you'll see a painting will be at the tilt. It will indicate the percentage at which it's tilted, what would happen to the landscape at that degree of change, and then there's recommended actions you could take at the bottom where it says, see what we can do. And so I asked them to choose a painting that they were drawn to, and then just use an organizer to present some information about the painting. So the title and the degree tilt, what will happen, in this case, the disappearance of 50% of the world glaciers, what are some recommended solutions, and what's a specific action step that they can take if they were to translate that recommendation to something they could do that's actionable. And it's interesting because often students will not agree with the recommended solution. They'll say, I think this is better. And that creates really fun discussion. But we do this with keeping in mind how does art make us more receptive to scientific warnings? I could just give them a graphic visualization of the daily rise of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is hugely important and powerful, and we need to know. But I think this coupled with, say, an art gallery visit, even virtually, is really, really compelling. Another entry point is compose food stories before talking about environmental impacts of the agricultural industry. So one of my favorite teachers, she's a high school science teacher in Philadelphia, says, instead of leading with the carbon cycle, we begin with talking about our favorite food and why we love it. And I will say, and you guys know this, food stories are the great equalizer. We all have strong opinions about certain foods. Food memories can evoke a certain time in our life, celebrate a treasured person, create a sense of ritual, reinforce our cultural identity, and establish a comforting routine. And so I model this by pairing it with an excerpt from one of my favorite books to read with students with The Fire on High. And we look at different aspects of food that I like. And this is a way that my students get to know me a little bit better. Talk about my mom's enchiladas, how I love banana pancakes on the weekends, how box brownies can really do the trick for me, how fusion cuisine is fascinating. Like here's Thai tacos, taking these staple ingredients from different cuisines and just mashing them together. And finally, beauty. This is my mother-in-law's flaw, and I truly think it's the most beautiful thing in the known universe. And my students often agree. But when I share these things, it helps them think about food stories they love. Like, what do I like? What do I want to talk about? And everyone has something to say when you talk about food stories. And so we start with what is one of your favorite meals, and then move to how could you make a more environmentally friendly version of that meal? And so we start to think about where does it come from? Is it grown here? How did it get to my plate? And so, again, that teacher that really inspires me, Heather, these are her directions. Take a meal from home that's important to you, take apart the components. Where did it come from? What was the carbon footprint of it? What did it mean to the environment? Try and think of a version of it that would still be culturally meaningful to you and your family, but might reduce the toll on the environment. Make a version of it that is more environmentally friendly. And all of a sudden, students are thinking, like, yeah, like, what distance did this food ingredient travel to get to my grocery store and then to my plate? But in a way that starts with their own personal food story that they already care about. So you have that buy-in already. Another entry point is engage in hexagonal thinking before weighing solutions. So this is a strategy where you put key terms on tiles and then you arrange them as you see fit. So with food consumption, we put the terms living sustainably, reducing food waste, overconsumption, regulating fast food intake, supporting local farmers and farmers markets. And based on how you arrange titles, you create questions that put some of those terms together. So some questions that my high school students generated is, well, what is the economic difference between buying fast food and supporting local farmers? Why is fast food so convenient? Why do we care so much about things being convenient? How aware is the general public of the impact of food waste? And what are the benefits of buying from farmer markets as opposed to regular grocery stores? And so all of a sudden you see them thinking in this elevated way about food simply by mashing these tiles together. And so a fun way I've done this is with the Smokey Bear campaign about wildfire. Do some research, y'all, find out what are the common causes of wildfire. What they'll uncover quickly is lightning, campfire, cigarettes, arson, electrical, like faulty power lines. But they rarely say invasive plants. And this is something that is not discussed in the Smokey Bear campaign, which is that non-native plants, because they're not evolved with the actual uh, habitat that they currently exist in, that they often dry out quickly. They don't have the same drought resilience and are fire fuel when they dry out. And so wildfire spreads more quickly. And so part of using hexagonal thinking, we can use with our media literacy goals. So thinking about what does it mean to be a media literate consumer? You could be like, I love the Smokey Bear campaign. I love Smokey the Bear, but maybe they should add this emphasis on about what's fire fuel so that we're even more knowledgeable and empowered to prevent wildfire spread quickly. And lastly, I just want to say part of how we meet the moment is talking about how we've told stories about environmental challenges. The way we frame the narrative is working or not working to our true benefit. So we've talked about a few examples today. The desert is not simply barren and empty. Recycling is not just the responsibility of the individual. Smokey the Bear, lovable, one of my favorite bears in the world, but maybe his campaign did not exhaustively talk about how we could halt the spread of wildfire. So, how is this narrative serving us? How can we tweak it to make it even better so we're more empowered to be able climate stewards? I want to thank you all for spending some time with me today. In a second, I'll push out a little handout to the chat, but I've really enjoyed talking about these entry points, and I'm just so delighted that we all care about this topic.
Sochi, that was amazing.